Hello, and welcome to Journey of an Author with Alfred Muller. This is episode 2 of what I hope to be a very long video stream, and what I'd like to start with today is conflict. If you missed my prior video, that one is on character development. I wanted to get a little bit more into the meat and bones of a story, and conflict is that central point, almost like the sun in the solar system when you're talking about a story. You want the conflict to drive every aspect of your story. Um, and let's dive into what is conflict. Before I do that, though, I'd like to remind you that I am an independent author, and if you like what you've heard in my last video, or if you like what I'm about to tell you in this video, go ahead and check out some of the short stories I have available. Tears Trial and Reaper Society. I have a third story, The Classics, coming out, and keep an eye out for my debut novel, The Water Crystal Rise of Azur Sulcaimana. All of that will be available on Kindle and Amazon. Links will be in the description below. But while you're all here, let's talk about conflict. What is conflict? Conflict is the issue, the problem, the obstacle, the barrier that prevents your characters from doing something. Uh, it is the main focus of a story in particular. Now, why? Why do we need conflict? Well, we need conflict because if you don't have it, there's no real story there. It would be like reading a grocery list. You do A, B, C, and D. That's great and fun, and even if you've built such an imaginative world, it's cool to see it, and it's almost like a one of those movies where you're watching with the video camera. It's like one of those. You're just looking around someone's world they created. For that, you can go on any simulator or watch them, hey, on YouTube. But when you don't have conflict, it's boring. It's like reading someone's diary without the juicy bits. Some random person you don't even know, and that could be hard for a reader to get through. And as an author, you want to attract your reader. You want to draw them into aspects of your story that you find unique and creative outside of just the world building. Um, and since we must have conflict, let's talk about a few ideas of conflict, a few examples of conflict. And I'll break them up into a few different categories. First of all, being easy, simple, basic conflict. That could be something as a locked door or a physical barrier blocking your character. It could even be a trait you've given your character. And I talk about traits in my first video. But what that conflict does is it adds minute details to a story. One, to help you write a little bit more, a little bit of description. You could use it to develop more of a scene. But it also gives the reader something to look forward to. All right, my character has approached the door. It's locked. What do they do? Do they have a specific set of skills like lockpicking? Or are they weak and can't bust down a door? They don't have the skill of lockpicking. How do they get around that barrier? As a reader, I want to know so I continue to read. For example, would be the Hunger Games, when Katniss has to simply find food. It's a way that you experience that character as she wanders through the woods. You get to know the world that she lives in, the society she exists in, and then after that, you finally see her catch some food, and you learn she has a specific trait in being able to shoot a squirrel through the eye at so many paces. Now let's talk about more moderate conflict, and I think this is conflict that has the most common representation in in writing, and in books and novels, or an author's repertoire is probably what I meant to say. And what that is a more physical conflict, a more in-your-face conflict. Some examples of that could be, I have it right here, when Ray Booth and his goons from The Stand beat up Nick Andros. It could also be when Percy Jackson from the Percy Jackson and the Last Olympian series ends up fighting the god Ares, or when we have the Troll in the Dungeon, classic meme now, and also saying from Harry Potter. Those kinds of conflict are physical. They take up large portions of a story. They normally have more attributed to them than just the physicality of it. For example, the Troll in the Dungeon, you start to learn that Harry has to survive on his own, Hermione has issues with friendship, and Ron is basically comedic relief. In the Percy Jackson series, you learn a major plot point where Ares is not necessarily a good guy, and Percy learns that he has the lightning bolt of Zeus in his backpack. Um, Also, huge Lord of the Rings fan, and with everybody watching The One Ring at the moment, a good point is the wraiths at the Prancing Pony when they go to kill the hobbits. That is another physical conflict. And when you have that, you also have the character introduction of Aragorn. So this kind of conflict, it has so many tools and tangents that could spread off of it, which is why it's used so often. Um, Outside of the simple conflict where you have to try and get through the door, you can see a wider array of talents that your characters have. Also, a wide array of weaknesses that they have. There's so many avenues to travel. Again, for the Prancing Pony, you get to meet a character. You get to learn that that character not only is skilled in deception, but also in survival. They are able to adapt and overcome any given situation. And that continues throughout that entire plot point because even though the conflict may seem resolved immediately when the wraiths stab the pillows, it is not, and it continues until they get to the abandoned tower where the wraiths finally confront Frodo and Aragorn shows up with the torch and sword and scares them off. And that's another aspect of conflict is duration. And for the main conflict point that I'd like to talk about is big conflict, epic conflict, conflict that lasts the duration of the story. For example, the end of the world. That is a common one. For Harry Potter, it would be Voldemort taking over. That's the big threat, the big conflict. For Percy Jackson, it would be Kronos coming back to life and ruling the world. For Lord of the Rings, it would be the One Ring controlling the world, coming back to Sauron. For The Stand, it would be the virus destroying the world. For the Mistborn series, for any of you Brandon Sanderson fans out there, it would be the Emperor continuing his empire, ruling with an iron fist and oppressing every other person in the world. This is the kind of conflict that you base a story on. You don't want it to be in every chapter necessarily, and by that I mean you don't want to hit the reader over the head every single chapter with this is what my story is about, this is what my story is about, this is what my story is about. This is why you have the basic conflict to entertain us for those brief scenes that you've created, or the moderate conflict to span a couple of chapters and tie in the main story. The big conflict, the epic conflict, is just for the story. A great example that I read in a foreword, actually, from Elantris, one of Brandon Sanderson's first novels. The individual who did the foreword for him spoke of how when Brandon Sanderson was first writing, he wrote basically just about a school wanting to be overthrown. What was wrong with that? Why wasn't that big enough? And this individual told Brandon Sanderson that everybody wants to read an end-of-the-world epic. They want the stakes to be so high because we all deal with basic conflict in our everyday life. You go to the grocery store, but you forgot your wallet. You go in and you start shopping for a handful of items, but you didn't grab a shopping cart. Those kinds of things are mundane, they're blah. We deal with them so often that when we read, we want to escape that. That being said, we tend to fear in real life the epic conflict. One of my most hated things that I've dealt with in my life is cancer. Not me personally, but family members. I hate that. I don't typically read books that deal with that, mostly because it just reminds me of that issue. For people who have trouble conceiving, reading books about a couple in a romance novel who can't have a child may be rough. These are things that epic problems and epic conflict talk about and are basically the positions that we start at when we're writing a novel. And they may determine what type of novel you want to write. A war between two kingdoms are probably not going to be in a romance novel. That's not saying they don't happen, but most likely you're probably reading a fantasy. A murder is most likely not going to happen in a cookbook. But the different style that we write in and the different genre that we choose can bring some of these conflicts in. And it's actually great to read a wide variety of stories because you can find more conflict and different conflict that you may not see in your typical fantasy. For example, in my book that'll be coming out in Thanksgiving, I do touch on a lot of this. I do have romance in that book. I do have a big end of the world conflict. I do have some small town stories and allegories that you may find interesting and fascinating because they all thrive off of different forms of conflict. Now, when you have conflict, obviously you have to have resolution. And why do you have to have resolution? Well, because otherwise all you have is conflict, and that's chaos. And while chaos may exist in the real world, you want to make order encapsulate that chaos. Because without order, you really just have a never-ending entropy, and eventually your story will just deteriorate. What is resolution? Well, for basic conflict, it would be getting through that door, or finding a way through that door. You can introduce a character who can break down the door. Maybe someone just happens to unlock it. Or it's not even the right entrance. You turn around and see, oh, that's where I have to get in. You could scale the building and enter a window. There's so many avenues to travel with that kind of conflict. Moderate conflict. How do you get about that one? What's the resolution to that? Well, you could either get your butt kicked by Ares, or you can beat them and see where that goes. Maybe the character ends up being more confident afterwards because they've just beat a god. Or maybe they realize that the obstacles they're up against are too great for them because they are up against gods. There's a need in humanity, I think, to resolve things. We don't like open-ended issues. We want to feel closure, and that's what resolution does. We give the reader something that they've been looking for. In movies, you could call it fan service, and that could be another form of conflict, but I could spend a whole video on that. Basically what I mean is when you give the reader what they want is resolution. When to do that, I guess, would be the next important part to talk about. Because if I introduce a door and your character sits outside that door for 10 days and I detail every single minute of those 10 days, I guarantee you that reader will put that book down. Because we don't want to read that. I've sat in a waiting room for 45 minutes and wanted to pull my hair out. As a reader, I want to miss that boring part that we live with. I want immediate resolution for that door, or alternative resolution for that door. I want to see him scale the building and enter a third-story window and interrupt a family eating dinner and get to the bottom of the stairs and then enter where I wanted the story to go. And you could always bring that family back. In a moderate, I want to see either A, my character get his butt whipped within the next 15, 20 pages, or I want to see my character thrive in that setting in the next 10 pages. Which reminds me, I'll probably do a video on conflict, specifically fighting, because I've enjoyed writing fight scenes. But I digress. The more interesting parts of resolution are when the reader gets that. And what I mean by that is timing. For the big conflict, you don't want to resolve it 45 pages in, and then you're reading the next 15, 20 chapters based on the outcome. That again is boring because the reader's sitting there wondering, What am I looking for? What am I reading for? What is the conflict that's supposed to be resolved at this point? If it is resolved in the first 45 pages, you probably want to alter how the story is constructed. Again, in a fight scene, or let's say when the Wraiths end up attacking at the Prancing Pony, we see that conflict stretch out. We don't get an immediate resolution. And what could a resolution to that be? Well, at first, we see that Aragorn has taken Merry, Pippin, Frodo, and Samwise out of the room they originally rented, and the Wraiths stab the beds. Now, that would seem as if that has closed that conflict. It hasn't, though, because the Wraiths are still on Frodo's tail. We get an additional resolution when we're at the tower, and Aragorn scares the Wraiths away. Now, in a sense, that does close that, because the main issue at that point, the main conflict, is Frodo is poisoned by the blade. The Wraiths are still following them, and the true resolution hasn't been taken care of, but the dynamic of the conflict has swapped. So, while one page has closed on the conflict of the Wraiths, a new one has opened tangential to the Wraiths. Again, being said, that has taken place over a few chapters. It's not instantaneous. It's not like the Wraiths disappear and never show up again in the story. That continues and causes the characters to make decisions. And that is where conflict's purpose really lies, is in character decision. Because without forcing a character into a situation or forcing them into a place where they're not comfortable, you can't have a story, for reasons that I mentioned earlier. What you don't want to see is conflict where, let's take a love story, because believe it or not, I do read romance novels from time to time. You have the main character, ugly chick, ugly woman, ugly man if you enjoy reading those books. They get to the point where they've found that love interest who can see deeper than just physical appearance, and they see that soul, and there's probably a montage of makeover, and all of a sudden that person looks like either Emma Stone or Ryan Gosling. Well, that's great. If it happens in the first 10 pages, then what else am I reading for? If they get together or kiss or have that moment of closure where I don't have to worry about them breaking up, then why am I still reading? If you enjoy fantasy novels and the war is ended and then you continue reading for the fallout of the war, well, what's at stake? A kingdom? Okay, why is the kingdom at stake? Is that worth reading? If it's just because poor decision making, it can throw a reader off. When we're introduced to a book and we see the main conflict is X, and X is solved in the next several pages, I don't know what I'm looking for then. So all of this to say, when you're pacing out your conflict, look at story. I want the Prancing Pony to be a speed bump for my characters, but I have many ideas that can piggyback off that, so that speed bump is large enough to encapsulate several chapters. If I just have a blocked door, maybe it's the main focus of a story, and for anybody who's still sitting and waiting for Patrick Rothfuss to finish his trilogy, we're still waiting for the Doors of Stone to open. So that's one way to do it. But if it's just a mundane door, and you drag that out, I'm going to put that book down. If it's the main conflict, and the main conflict is a end of the world event, and the end of the world event happens right at the beginning of the page, I don't know where I'm going with that. If I'm just watching a survival story, I'd probably just put on Discovery Plus. Now, that's not to say that other authors and better authors than me haven't changed the structure that I'm putting out there, but I think for the majority of us, it's probably best to stick to the norms, at least until you get to that point where you feel confident in your writing to expand. And in that, let's talk about some good conflict. And bad conflict, actually. Let's start with bad conflict. Bad conflict is non-important issues that rise up just because. For example, in The Hunger Games, if we were to watch Katniss trip over a tree branch and scrape her knee, that's okay, but what does it add? Does that knee scrape turn into an infection that causes an issue in the Hunger Games? Or is it just to fill in because I didn't know what else to write? If it's just to fill in, then maybe you should either make a through line to further chapters or just cut it entirely, because I don't want to read just spare words if I'm a reader. And as a writer, it could be a fun tool to help start the creative juices and get them flowing so you can create that masterpiece. But if it doesn't fit in the story, you may want to cut it before the reader cuts your book from their to-be-read pile. Another bad example would be a love story where the love interest is already infatuated with the main character. If they're infatuated and the main character likes that character and they get together and they're happily ever after, that's probably a bad premise to start your story. You don't want to start a love story with them already in love. Unless you're going to build some horrific, tragic breakup, which I guess Friends did pretty well between Ross and Rachel. But again, the premise of that series was not specifically Ross and Rachel. It was a group of friends living in New York City. Like I said, again, better authors than me have changed what I'm saying, but I think it's a good path to follow for us new authors. Another bad example of conflict would be just a fight. Just a straight up fight where your main character is beat up or beats up a random person and nothing comes of it. You don't want your conflict to be a one-hit wonder. You want your conflict to expand, to continue. Again, a door solved very quickly could cause timing. Maybe your character doesn't get to where they need to be in time. Maybe they're eventually caught because the delay caused them to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. In a fight, maybe being beaten up causes them to have those internal struggles where, what do I do? Do I face off with the gods, or do I just go back to my home and hope everything works out? And big conflict, a bad big conflict would be, I really, really hate to bring this up, but Indiana Jones. When Indy's main conflict in the first Raiders of the Lost Ark is the Nazis taking the Lost Ark, and Indy doesn't really do anything. He's just there. And the Nazis would have opened the Ark if they found it or not, and would have melted, and nothing would have come of it. Perhaps the Ark would have stayed hidden. I don't want to get into a debate on it, but if you have any ideas, put them in the comment and I'd love to answer. But basically, that's a bad, big conflict. If the Nazis had found a way to prevent the Ark from melting them into skeletons, and Indy had a more important role, that would be a big conflict. Maybe if he ended up failing and they opened the Ark, well, then it's actually a world-ending event. And maybe in Temple of Doom, when Indiana Jones is faced off with going off on the next adventure, he struggles with that because he failed in being able to prevent the Nazis. But having the Ark solve his issue for him is the very literal definition of Deus Ex Machina, which just means God interference, to break it down. But good conflict. Let's talk about the Stormlight Archives, also by Brandon Sanderson. When Kaladin is a slave, he has to deal with the internal struggles of should he escape. You're introduced quickly with the fact that every time he's tried, everybody with him dies. He is the only survivor. When you're talking about Katniss, standing up for her sister and taking her place, that is conflict that any one of us would enjoy reading. For Harry Potter, when Harry is forced with the situation to sacrifice himself in order to be able to defeat Voldemort, because he himself is a Horcrux. these conflicts resonate with people. They are more than just the words on the page. They touch the humanity of all of us. I think when you're talking about humanity and conflict, you want to bring that to the forefront as much as possible. Scabbing your knee or scraping your knee, we've all done that. It's relatable, but it's boring. I healed up pretty quick from all my scrapes and bruises. A broken bone, on the other hand, not everybody has experienced, but we know, wow, that looks like it could really hurt. We've all seen somebody with a broken bone. Maybe not physically broken, but the cast at least. So we can relate to that in some respects. The conflict of a story brings the reader into it. It touches the reader on a level of being that all of us struggle with on a daily basis. I work in retail, and when people come up to me and ask, how are you doing? I just say, I'm fine, because in the everyday world, we don't want to hear about other people's problems. When we're reading, however, I want to know every issue that character has, as long as it relates to the larger story. I want to connect to that character because I chose to pick up that book. When you're writing conflict, just keep that in mind, that you're trying to connect on a human level, and you want to keep the reader entertained as you tell the story. Chapters without conflict could end up boring the reader and sending them on the path of another book. When you are reading a story and you get to a point where you're bored, it's probably because the conflict has either been resolved too quickly or hasn't been resolved quickly enough. If that happens, as an author, you may want to sit there and edit it a little bit more. Even if you have to, for the time being, add a knee scrape just to get by and see if it's more entertaining. Perhaps whatever the conflict was could continue on. Maybe your main character gets arrested, and instead of being released on bail by a benevolent rich person, they're actually sitting in jail struggling because the guy who was also brought in drunk is belligerent and wants to fight. If you were dealing with a blocked door, don't just make it unlocked. Maybe make it locked and see how that character responds. With a main arc, maybe don't go generic with end of the world. Maybe it is just the end of a university that has stood for thousands of years in your fantasy world, and with the loss of that university, magic in itself is gone. These elements of a conflict can turn your book from bargain bin to grander tale. And I think all of us, with given the right situation, can tell that tale. So, if you've enjoyed this video, I've enjoyed talking about it. I'd love to talk about it more in the comments. So if you've enjoyed it, leave a comment, like, subscribe. And if you're curious about some of my work, I'll leave some links in the description. Like I said, Tears Trial and Reaper Society. One's fantasy, one's urban fantasy. And two different sides of me, I would say. One's lighthearted and coming of age. The other one is more dark and deals with death on a very real basis. So, I'd love to talk to you guys next time, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Take it easy.